Roche. If you've ever taken a vitamin, used a diabetes monitor, or received cancer treatment, you've probably encountered this name. It's one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, with a market capitalization exceeding $300 billion. It employs over 100,000 people across more than 100 countries. It produces some of the most important drugs in modern medicine, including cancer treatments that generate tens of billions in annual revenue. But here's what almost nobody knows. Roche is not controlled by institutional investors or a public board. It's controlled by two Swiss families who have owned it for over 130 years and have no intention of ever letting go. The Hoffmann and Oeri families hold absolute control over Roche through a share structure so unusual that it defies every norm of modern corporate governance. They maintain voting control while owning only a fraction of the economic value. They've passed this control down through 5 generations. They've survived 2 world wars, economic crises, scientific revolutions, and aggressive takeover attempts. And they've done it all while staying almost completely invisible to the public. This is not a story about Switzerland's famous banks or luxury watches. This is a story about how a single family turned a small chemical dye factory into one of the most powerful pharmaceutical empires on Earth. About how they pioneered mass production of medicines that saved millions of lives. About how they structured ownership in a way that allowed them to maintain control across generations while still accessing public capital markets. And about how they became some of the richest people in Europe without anyone noticing. The story begins in Basel, Switzerland, in 1896. Fritz Hoffmann La Roche was born in 1868 into a family of merchants and traders in Basel, a city on the Rhine River that had long been a hub of commerce and industry. Fritz's family wasn't wealthy, but they were connected. His father ran a trading business dealing in colonial goods like tobacco and spices. Fritz grew up learning the ins and outs of import-export trade, but he was restless. He wanted to build something bigger. In the late 1880s, Basel was undergoing an industrial transformation. The city's location on the Rhine made it ideal for chemical manufacturing, which required large amounts of water. Several small companies had sprung up producing synthetic dyes for the textile industry. These dyes were revolutionary because they were cheaper and more consistent than natural dyes. Fritz saw an opportunity, but he didn't want to just make dyes. He wanted to apply chemical manufacturing techniques to something more valuable: medicine. At the time, most medicines were made by individual pharmacists mixing compounds by hand. Quality was inconsistent. Dosages varied. There was no standardization. Fritz believed that if medicines could be mass-produced in factories using the same chemical processes as dyes, they could be made safer, more effective, and more affordable. It was a radical idea. Most doctors and pharmacists were skeptical. They didn't trust factory-made drugs. But Fritz was convinced the future belonged to industrial pharmaceutical production. In 1896, at age 28, Fritz founded F. Hoffmann La Roche Company with an initial investment of 100,000 Swiss francs, much of it borrowed. He rented a small building in Basel and hired a handful of chemists. His first products were basic: cough syrups, digestive tonics, disinfectants, nothing revolutionary. But Fritz's real innovation was in marketing and distribution. He didn't just sell medicines to pharmacies. He branded them. He created recognizable packaging. He advertised directly to doctors. He built a sales force that traveled across Europe, promoting Roche products. Within a few years, Roche medicines were being sold in Germany, Austria, France, and Russia. Fritz understood something critical. Doctors were conservative. They trusted what they knew. To win them over, he needed to prove that factory-made medicines were not just cheaper, but better. So he invested heavily in quality control. He hired university-trained chemists to test every batch. He published scientific papers demonstrating the consistency and purity of Roche product. Slowly, the medical establishment began to take him seriously. In 1898, Roche launched its first major success: a cough medicine called Cyrolin, made from a standardized herbal extract. It was nothing revolutionary scientifically, but it was the first mass-produced branded medicine in Switzerland. Sales exploded. By 1900, Roche employed over 100 people and was exporting products to more than 20 countries. The small factory expanded. New buildings were constructed. Fritz reinvested every franc of profit back into the business. But Fritz wasn't satisfied with incremental growth. He wanted breakthroughs. In 1905, Roche began producing Digolan, a heart medication derived from digitalis, a plant extract that had been used for centuries but never standardized. Roche's version was chemically pure, precisely dosed, and clinically tested. It became one of the most prescribed heart medications in Europe. For the first time, Roche had a blockbuster drug. The success of Digolan changed everything. Fritz now had capital and credibility. He expanded aggressively, opening offices in London, Paris, New York, and St. Petersburg. He hired more chemists and built a research laboratory dedicated to discovering new medicines. By 1914, Roche employed over 500 people and generated millions of francs in annual revenue. It was no longer a small family business. It was a pharmaceutical powerhouse. Then came World War I. The war devastated Europe's economy and disrupted international trade. Roche's operations in Germany, Austria, and Russia were cut off. Profits collapsed. Fritz faced a critical decision: shut down and wait out the war or pivot. He chose to pivot. Roche shifted production to medications needed for the war effort: disinfectants, painkillers, anesthetics. The company survived by serving military hospitals. But Fritz never forgot the vulnerability of relying on European markets. After the war, he resolved to build a truly global company. Fritz Hoffmann La Roche died in 1920 at age 52, just as the company was recovering from the war. His death was sudden and unexpected. He left behind a company with enormous potential but no clear succession plan. Control passed to a small group of family members and early investors. This could have been the end. Many family businesses collapse after the founder dies, but Roche didn't. Why? Because Fritz had built something more than a business. He had built an institution, a company culture focused on research, quality, and long-term thinking. That culture survived him. In 1921, Roche made a discovery that would change the company forever. Scientists at Roche successfully synthesized and mass-produced vitamins for the first time in history. Specifically, vitamin C. This was revolutionary. Until then, vitamins could only be obtained from food. Now they could be manufactured in factories and taken as supplements. Roche patented the process and began producing vitamins on an industrial scale. Within a decade, Roche vitamins were sold worldwide. This single product category generated enormous profits and gave Roche the capital to invest in even more ambitious research. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Roche pioneered the mass production of other vitamins, including vitamin A, vitamin E, and B-complex vitamins. These weren't glamorous drugs that cured diseases, but were essential. Millions of people took them daily. They generated steady, predictable revenue. They funded research into more experimental medicines. The vitamin business became the financial foundation of the modern Roche empire. But the family understood something critical. To remain independent and grow aggressively, Roche needed capital. In 1924, the company went public, listing shares on the Swiss stock exchange. However, the family did something unusual. They created two classes of shares. One class, called bearer shares, could be freely traded and gave holders dividends and limited voting rights. The other class, called participation certificates, gave holders economic rights but no voting power. The family retained a majority of the voting shares. This structure allowed Roche to raise capital from the public, while the family maintained absolute control. It was brilliant and controversial. By the 1930s, Roche was one of the most profitable pharmaceutical companies in Europe. But World War II brought another existential crisis. Switzerland remained neutral, but it was surrounded by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Roche's international operations were again cut off. Worse, the Nazis demanded that Roche supply medicines to the German military. If Roche refused, the Nazis threatened to seize the company's assets in Germany. If Roche complied, It risked being accused of collaboration. The family navigated this nightmare carefully, supplying only basic medicines and keeping detailed records to prove they provided no military advantage. After the war, those records helped clear Roche of collaboration charges. The post-war years were transformative. Roche invested heavily in antibiotic research, developing new formulations of penicillin and other drugs. In 1960, Roche launched Valium, a benzodiazepine tranquilizer that became the most prescribed drug in America throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Valium alone generated billions in revenue. It was followed by Librium, another blockbuster tranquilizer. For 2 decades, Roche dominated the market for psychiatric medications. But success brought scrutiny. By the 1970s, doctors and regulators began questioning the safety and overprescription of tranquilizers like Valium. Their addiction concerns, lawsuits, regulatory crackdowns. Roche's reputation took a hit. Profits from tranquilizers began to decline. The company needed a new direction. That direction came in the 1980s and 1990s with biotechnology. Roche invested billions into developing genetically engineered drugs, particularly for cancer treatment. In 1986, Roche launched interferon, a biotech drug for treating viral infections and certain cancers. It was moderately successful, but the real breakthrough came in the late 1990s with Herceptin, a targeted cancer therapy for breast cancer, and Rituxan, a treatment for lymphoma. These drugs were revolutionary. They worked by targeting specific cancer cells while sparing healthy tissue. They saved lives, and they generated tens of billions in revenue. By the 2000s, Roche had become the global leader in oncology, the treatment of cancer. The company invested more in cancer research than any other pharmaceutical firm. It acquired Genentech, a pioneering American biotech company, for $47 billion in 2009, one of the largest pharmaceutical acquisitions in history. This gave Roche complete control over a pipeline of blockbuster cancer drugs and solidified its position as the dominant player in oncology. Today, Roche generates over $60 billion in annual revenue. It employs more than 100,000 people. It holds patents on some of the most important medicines in the world, including cancer treatments, diabetes diagnostics, and COVID-19 tests. And yet, despite being a publicly traded company, it remains firmly controlled by the Hoffmann and Oeri families. The current ownership structure is extraordinary. The families hold roughly 9% of the company's total equity value, but control over 50% of the voting rights through the dual share structure created nearly a century ago. This means they can block any takeover attempt, veto any major strategic decision, and appoint board members without needing approval from other shareholders. Public investors own most of the economic value but have almost no say in how the company is run. This structure has made the families extraordinarily wealthy. André Hoffmann, a great-grandson of the founder, has a net worth estimated at over $10 billion. Members of the Oeri family, descendants of Fritz's original business partners, are worth billions as well. Together, the families control one of the largest pools of private wealth in Europe. Yet they live relatively quiet lives in Basel, far from the public eye. They rarely give interviews. They don't flaunt their wealth. They operate through family offices and trusts. They're invisible billionaires. The dual share structure has been controversial. Critics argue it's undemocratic and allows a small group of heirs to control a company they no longer actively manage it. They point out that public shareholders have no real power despite owning most of the company. Shareholder activists have repeatedly challenged the structure, demanding equal voting rights. But Swiss law permits dual-class shares, and the families have shown no interest in changing it. They argue that family control allows Roche to focus on long-term research rather than short-term profits. They point to Roche's century of success as evidence that their model works, and in many ways they're right. Roche has survived longer than almost any other pharmaceutical company. It has navigated wars, economic crises, scientific revolutions, and regulatory upheavals. It has maintained independence while competitors were acquired or went bankrupt. The family's long-term thinking allowed Roche to invest in risky research that public companies, pressured by quarterly earnings reports, might have avoided. Drugs like Herceptin took decades to develop. A short-term focused company might have given up, but the cost of this control is opacity. Roche discloses the minimum required by Swiss regulations, which are less stringent than American or European Union rules. The families rarely explain their decision-making. The public has no insight into how strategic choices are made or what priorities guide the company. This creates a power imbalance that many find troubling in an industry that affects public health. The Hoffmann and Oeri dynasty represents a model of capitalism that is increasingly rare. Family-controlled, long-term focused, and resistant to outside interference. In an era when most major companies are controlled by institutional investors and activist hedge funds, Roche operates according to its own logic. The families have prioritized continuity and control over maximizing short-term shareholder returns, and for over 130 years that strategy has worked. But questions remain. As the families grow larger and more distant from the company's operations, will they continue to prioritize Roche's mission? Will younger generations who inherited wealth but not the founder's vision maintain the same discipline and long-term thinking? And in an industry facing increasing pressure over drug prices, access, and ethics, can a family-controlled company navigate these challenges while remaining accountable only to itself? The Hoffmann and Oeri families have built one of the most enduring business empires in modern history. They've done it quietly, methodically, and with almost no public recognition. They've shown that it's possible to control a global corporation for over a century while staying invisible. But they've also shown the limits of democratic capitalism. When ownership and control are concentrated in a few hands, even a publicly traded company can operate beyond public accountability. The Koch dynasty showed how wealth can reshape politics. The Hoffmann dynasty shows how wealth can control industries that affect life and death. Both raise the same fundamental question. In a world where capital grants power, who decides how that power is used? And when those decisions affect millions of people, should they be made behind closed doors by families accountable to no one but themselves? Now tell me, did you know that Roche was controlled by a single family for over 130 years? What do you think about family-controlled corporations in industries like pharmaceuticals? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to suggest other hidden empires you want us to uncover. Hit that like button and subscribe to support our deep dives into the world's most powerful dynasties.